Hi guys, and welcome back to my review of the Friday the 13th franchise. If you haven't seen them, I have already reviewed Friday the 13th Part 1 and Part 2, and I will link them here so you can go and check them out. In today's episode, we are talking about Friday the 13th Part 3, which was released in 1982, 1 year after the release of Friday the 13th Part 2, and it sees the return of Steve Miner in the director's chair. I have actually already filmed this episode, but I got about halfway through it before I realised that I didn't have my microphone plugged in. So this is take 2. So Friday the 13th Part 3 has a rotten rating of 7% on Rotten Tomatoes and an audience rating of 42%. Apparently, Martin J. Sadoff, the 3D effect supervisor on Part 3, is responsible for coming up with the idea of the iconic hockey mask. He was a huge hockey fan and would often have a bag of hockey gear on set with him, and when the filmmakers were looking for a new look for Jason, he offered up a Detroit Red Wing goalie hockey mask. But as Steve Miner and Frank Mancuso, the director and producer of the movie, loved this idea, and the makeup artist made a mould of and altered the hockey mask, and then finally the production designer created various versions of the hockey mask, I think it's probably safer to say that this was a combined effort and a combined creation. The original story idea for Part 3 was to see the return of Ginny, the final girl from Part 2, and we would find her in a sanatorium recovering from the trauma after the events of the second film. And intent on revenge, it would see Jason track her down to the sanatorium and then proceed to kill the staff and patients. But Amy Steele, who played Ginny, turned down the offer to return for this film. The Higgins house, barn and lake that was used as the setting for Part 3 were all purpose-built on location and were still standing until unfortunately the house burnt down in 2006 when a fan lit a fire in the fireplace downstairs. I read that according to the book Crystal Lake Memories, the attack on Chris by Jason before the events of Part 3 was originally intended to be an assault, and the reason for this was that Part 3 was originally intended to be the end of the story. It was just going to be a trilogy, and so the filmmakers wanted the audiences to really dislike Jason and ultimately be happy when Chris killed him at the end. Because yes, like I said, Part 3 was originally meant to be the end of the story, so when you see Jason lying on the barn floor at the end, he is meant to be dead at that point. But then I also read that the filmmakers didn't want the assault to be explicitly clear because they didn't want to pull the audience out of the otherwise quite light tone of the film. Okay, now for some positives in the film, the first one being the setting. Now, after 2 films set at a camp, I do appreciate the break from it and the change in setting. I like that we have the Higgins house and barn and the diner store that Harold and Edna live in, and then the grocery store that Shelley and Vera visit later. But as much as I appreciate this variety, that doesn't mean that I need to spend 1/3 of this movie in a frickin' barn. You know, the barn, that horror staple where everybody loves to hang out. Part 3 continues with the tradition of the opening of the movie recapping the end of the previous movie. But what I liked in Part 3 was the additional footage that they filmed where you see Jason lying on the floor and he moves and there's the machete lying next to him. So this confirms that Jason survived Ginny's attack, but I think it also implies that the last Jason jump scare at the end of Part 2 was in fact a dream sequence. Which, if this is the case, then I think that it also implies that the dead dog that they found in Part 2 was probably actually Muffin. R.I.P. Muffin. I also really appreciate the change in the opening titles as well. The opening title sequences from the last 2 films were incredibly boring. So this new sweepy 3D font and this funky remix of the Friday theme song is a very welcome change. And I much prefer the opening of Part 3 to the opening of Part 2. Instead of just following Alice slowly walk around her apartment for 12 minutes, this time we are treated to Harold and Edna, 2 characters that I do find very entertaining. You have Edna, a woman who wears stockings and rollers in her hair and just is constantly shouting at her poor husband. And there's a scene which I don't know why I find it so entertaining, but she's so slowly and carefully and intricately winding up this ball of wool only to dump it to the side of her where it all unravels again. What was the point? And we have Harold, a guy who just eats anything that he can get his hands on. He's walking around his store just picking up things, eating it, putting it back, picking up a drink, having a swig, putting it back. Stop eating and drinking your stock, Harold. And he also has this beautiful pet rabbit, which his wife Edna calls a disgusting creature. It's not a disgusting creature, it's beautiful. But when Harold takes it back to its cage and he discovers that his other pet rabbits have been killed by a snake, his reaction is to run away screaming and go to the toilet. And I love the fact that the events of part 3 pick up immediately after the events of part 2, and the fact that Jason even goes to the effort of refreshing his outfit. It's just a nice little expansion of this in-movie world that we have. And I think that part 3 actually has some smart writing within it, things that are included in the script earlier in the film that pay off later on without them having to be explained. So for example, throughout the film you have Shelley pulling pranks on everybody else, including faking his own death. So it's a nice little touch later on when Chili doesn't initially believe Shelley when he comes through the door with his throat slit. And at the end of the film, when Chris is trying to escape by driving away in her van, but she can't because there's no fuel in it, the script did a really good job of creating this situation. Earlier in the film, Shelley and Vera go to the grocery store where they bump into a biker gang, and they accidentally run over the gang's bikes, and so in retaliation, the gang follow Vera and Shelley back to the house and they steal the fuel from the van, leading to Chris being unable to escape at the end of the film and keeping the action around the house and the barn. I think they also did a really good job with this in Friday Part 2, when the audience is shown that Ginny has trouble with her car starting in a really nice organic way, and so that pays off in the final act when Ginny tries to escape and she can't. Again, it keeps the action around the camp and the lake. A huge positive for me in Part 3 is the change in Jason. I said in my review for Part 2 that I'm not the biggest fan of that version of him. I just don't find him scary. Whereas this Jason is instantly more intimidating just from that initial scene where he's stalking through the bed sheets that are hung up outside Harold and Edna's. I also think they do an excellent job of showing us just how strong this Jason is. I really love the reveal of Fox's kill, where we see that she's pinned to a wooden beam with a pitchfork, but then there's this great bit where the camera pans down and we see that she's actually dangling up in the air, so he's had to be strong enough to lift her and pin her up off the floor with a pitchfork. And of course there's Rick's death, where Jason squeezes his head so hard that his eyeball pops out and flies at the screen all 3D like. And my final positive for this movie is actually the final girl, Chris. Now I'll be honest, the first time I watched Part 3 I wasn't the biggest fan of her. I don't know if it's because I just didn't think it was the best acting or if she was the best final girl, but on this rewatch I really think she is a good and effective final girl. Despite the fact that she's still processing through trauma after a previous attack, she still goes into survival mode. She attacks Jason with a knife and with a wooden log. She knocks him out to slow him down so she can drive away to safety. And then even when she can't, when the van stops because it has no fuel, and Jason runs up to the van and attacks her, she makes the really clever move of winding up the window and trapping Jason's hands in the window. I think Chris is definitely helped by her knowing her surroundings and making good use of this. I think this is shown perfectly when she does lure Jason into the barn. My only issue with Chris as a final girl though, and it is a teensy one, is that she's just so loud. She just keeps screaming all the time and advertising her location to Jason. Even Alice from the first one knew to whimper instead of scream. But by the end of the movie, that girl is broken. She might have survived physically, but Jason has won. Although at least it's an improvement of Alice's dreamy staring into space after just lopping Mrs. Voorhees' head off. I only have two mixed aspects about this movie. The first one being the storyline. Now don't get me wrong, I like that we have a bit of variety from camp counselors, but when boiled down to its basic core, we are still following a group of attractive young adults getting picked off one by one. And I think it just would have been interesting to see the original story idea played out in film. And secondly, it's Chris's traumatic memory. Now, on this second watch, I am convinced that this is an event that did really happen, but on my first watch of the film, there was a little bit of confusion as to whether this did really happen or not, because it's not as though Friday isn't guilty of fake dream sequence fake outs. And if this is a real event, does that mean that Jason did assault Chris? And if so, then that just stands out so much in a franchise where this characteristic within Jason is never visited again. But then after researching it, and like I mentioned in the facts section of this episode, there were reasons behind this storyline being included. Okay, now moving on to my negatives for part 3. And my main negative with this movie is the characters in it. I just really struggle to understand how A, these characters know each other, and B, why they would spend time together. They go away for a friend's weekend away together and spend barely any time in each other's company outside of the little couples. And even when they do spend time together, they're often complaining about each other or telling each other to stop goofing about. Shelley, for me, is hands down the worst character in this movie. His sense of humour just completely misses the mark for me. This is a guy who thinks it's funny to pretend that he's been murdered and pretend to attack a woman. And I also think it's odd how this movie tries to make a joke about how a beautiful woman shouldn't be out on her own in the dark, within the same movie that is trying to portray the trauma felt by a character who is a beautiful woman who was attacked after being outside on her own in the dark. And I also really struggle to buy into the relationship between the main love interests, Chris and Rick. Are they a couple? Were they a couple? I just don't buy the chemistry between them. And I mean, he gets to the point where he seems to have very little patience for her, despite the fact that she's clearly going through something. And she's just running hot and cold with him and confusing the poor boy. So my overall thoughts on Friday the 13th are that it's a fun movie with a pretty decent final girl, but as it's essentially telling the same story that we've already seen in 2 previous movies, it's now getting a little bit tired. So there you have it, guys, my review of Friday the 13th Part 3, released in 1982. If you haven't seen them already, do check out my reviews for Friday the 13th Part 1 and Part 2. And if you are enjoying this franchise review, then don't forget to click that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of the other episodes. In the meantime though, thank you as always for stopping by. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye, guys.